Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are discussing what you can learn from your score report if you failed the bar. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. If you got bad news on the bar exam, it's tempting to put your head in the sand and try to move on as quickly as possible. Now, while this impulse is understandable, it's also important to take a step back and really try to figure out why it was that you failed the test so that you can try to pass next time. And painful though it may be, one of the best ways to do this is actually to look carefully at your bar exam score reports. So Lee, does everybody get a bar exam score report if they fail the bar?
Almost everybody. I think New Jersey doesn't, which I think is really cruel. And they just switched over to the UBE too. So it's like they changed.
Yeah, it's weird. They give you almost no information.
Yeah. So if you're in one of those states, you should call the bar and try and see if you can get your score report. I actually had someone tell me they did petition the bar to get more information about their scores and even get their past exams, and it finally worked out. So you never know. You could always call and ask. But hopefully you have something to work with. A lot of people will sometimes put these in a drawer and just not want to look at them, but you really need to take it out because some states provide a detailed breakdown of your scores on each essay and performance test, and even your performance test on each topic on the UBE. Now, unfortunately, some of this information be kind of confusing. If this is the first time you're seeing it, it can just be a lot of numbers. You're not really sure what's passing, what's failing. But at this point, you and I have read a lot of score reports over the years.
This is very true. I have to say, I had not read a lot of them until fairly recently, but now I feel like I am definitely an expert on interpreting a score report.
Yes.
From any jurisdiction. You send it over and I can pretty much tell you what it means.
Exactly. So we thought it might be helpful to kind of break it down for our listeners, so you guys can, get a better idea of what you have in your hand and what you can learn from it. So, because I like to put things in lists as you do, here are 4 things to look for in your score report.
All right. And before we get started, I will also put in a plug. If the jurisdiction is not going to automatically send you your essays, you need to get those, even if you don't feel like you want to look at them. And even if they're charging you money, which I understand is really frustrating and annoying, just go ahead and order them because they will be useful.
Absolutely. I think
we're not going to talk about that here, but just get them.
Yeah, you can learn so much by going through those exam questions. And it's not like you just go through them once. Oftentimes, even when my students are studying again, later in the process, they'll go back and look at some of those questions and be like, wow, that's what I did on the exam. I didn't know I did that. So it just brings a lot of clarity to the situation of studying again.
Well, and people can look at them for you and help you figure out like, okay, these are the things that universally you need to work on, etc. All right. So putting that aside, what can we learn from our score report?
Well, the first thing that you can learn is how close you were to passing, which is actually very important information.
Yes, and this one I think even New Jersey tells you.
Yeah. So even the least forthcoming states are going to tell you your overall score and the score required to pass. And it's important to note if you're new to the bar exam world that not everyone has the same score to pass. Even if you're in a UBE jurisdiction, the states can still set their own passing thresholds. So it's possible that you may fail, let's say, Oregon, but you pass New York at the same time because you could be licensed in New York and not licensed in Oregon. So it can be kind of frustrating, but you want to make sure that you understand what the passing threshold is in the state where you sat. But this score report that'll tell you your overall score gives you in general terms how close you were to passing. If your overall score is within 10 points of passing, we think you have a pretty good shot at passing on your next try. You likely need to do more targeted writing practice, maybe use a tool such as Adapt-A-Bar for the MBE, and maybe get some feedback on your work because it's possible you're leaving points on the table with how you're executing the written part of the exam. But Alison, what happens if you're looking at like a 30 or 40 point deficit? Now, before we go on, it should probably be noted that we're really talking more in the UBE realm with these numbers, because California has their own strange numerical system because their passing score is a 1440.
Right. So there you may be thinking in terms of, if you're 50 points away versus 200 points away.
Exactly.
But, you can extrapolate with your particular jurisdiction based on this general sense of, if you're 5% away from passing, you've got a pretty good shot. But yeah, I mean, if you're looking at a UBE state, for example, just so people are aware that the passing rates for the UBE are somewhere between like a 260 to a 275 or so. Yeah. So that's kind of what our point of comparison is. So, if you're looking at making up, say, a 30 or 40 point deficit, I think that's where you really start thinking, okay, I've got some serious work to do here. In this range, you need to be looking carefully at every aspect of your preparation. And you're really realistically probably going to need some significant help to learn how to write a passing essay and performance test and to get a solid score on the MBE. So, you might be looking at an MBE tutor, you might be looking at a writing tutor. I mean, you can overcome a deficit, a fairly large one, but you've got to be realistic about what that's going to require.
Yeah.
And oftentimes these are the situations, I think, where people have had problems going back to that first year of law school. Mm-hmm. So part of what you've got to be thinking about here is, do you actually have time to make these corrections before the next exam? This is definitely not, I'll just retake the same bar course, maybe study a little more and probably I'll pass. Maybe you can do that if you're 5 points away. But if you're 45 points away, you're really going to have to fundamentally change the way you're preparing and probably the way you're writing and the way you're approaching the MBE to have a decent shot at passing.
I think that's really true. And when we do intake calls with people who failed the bar, one of the things I often go back to when I'm looking at deficits of this amount is, hey, did you struggle in law school? And that's kind of one of the things we want to go back to, because if you did struggle with those first year classes, if you did struggle with essay exams, there are likely some underlying problems that need to be fixed. Which the good news is that means that maybe across the board solutions will help raise all of your scores, but it's likely that this stuff has been plaguing you. I think after working with students for all these years, I often will get the feedback once they have passed the bar, that they wish that they had some of these writing skills when they were in law school.
Yeah, exactly. I think we actually talked about that at lunch when we decided to form the Law School Toolbox, because we thought, hey, we could just teach people this when they start as 1Ls, and then they probably wouldn't be failing the bar.
Wow, that was a long, long time ago at this point.
It was a long time ago, but I think it still stands.
Yeah.
Because, the reality is, generally speaking, if you're failing the bar, the first time you take it by a pretty large deficit, you probably have had issues all along, and maybe you took paper classes or something and got your grades up in your second and third year, but you maybe really never fundamentally knew how to write, an IRAC or write concisely or write quickly. The other thing I think people need to be thinking about here is whether they need accommodations.
Yeah. Oftentimes when someone has a really large deficit, I like to raise the question of, have you ever had accommodations before? And we've talked about accommodations on another podcast episode, which we'll link to in the show notes. But it can be a big deal to have accommodations on the bars. But if you have a learning difference, if you struggle with anxiety, or even if you have a medical condition, sometimes a new medical condition. I've definitely talked to students who struggle with pain and can't sit for long periods of time, or if they type for a certain number of hours that they are in excruciating pain. Well, excruciating pain is going to make it hard to pass the exam. And so the bar oftentimes will give you some accommodations to try and get through that. But you need to explore these accommodations options to see if they may help you even the playing field when you're trying to sit for the exam again. And I would recommend that if you believe that you are a good candidate for accommodations, especially based on a history of accommodations, but you do not have time to apply for those accommodations, you need to talk to someone and evaluate whether or not you should delay your exam to get those accommodations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the other thing you can think about in a UBE state is, are there states that are more or less generous? Some of them are definitely not very generous about giving accommodations, even if you've had them in law school in New York. We're looking at you.
Yes, we are looking at you in New York.
The point being, you could take, say you sit in New Jersey and New Jersey is happy to give you accommodations, you can transfer that score. Yeah. So, I think you need to be a little bit strategic if you've been denied or something like that about reapplying and where that might make sense.
I think that's true. And different jurisdictions have different deadlines for putting in these applications as well. So let's say a new medical condition has arisen for you. You had surgery recently, and maybe the paperwork won't go through in time in the jurisdiction that you're in, but maybe the one, like New Jersey, like you drive a little further, and then New Jersey will let you have a application like submitted at a later date. You can look at this now. I mean, this didn't even used to be an option. So this kind of forum shopping idea is now available to you. And I think sometimes you have to get creative to make sure you can get the circumstances that you need to likely pass the test.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes people that we talk to actually have a score that's high enough to have passed in one jurisdiction. And occasionally we can even prevent them from having to take the test again because they come and we say, well, sometimes people just need to be admitted literally in some state. And it's like, well, you could just go to, Arizona or whatever has a 260 and get admitted. So that's also worth considering if your score is close to passing in the place you want to be, but is actually passing somewhere else.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. is a popular option because it's pretty easy to waive into Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So anyway, there are definitely a lot more options than even, say, a few years ago for how you can think strategically about your UBE bar experience.
Yep. Now, we kind of skipped over this idea of like a 10 to 20 point deficit. So Alison, what about people who missed not by just a few points, but aren't really in that, oh my gosh, I missed by 40 points situation?
Well, I think you've really got to dig into what happened on test day to figure out which of these sort of two categories you're going to be in. So maybe you just had a bad day, you didn't sleep well, you got sick, something happened. You got some topics that you were less confident in on the essays. You might feel pretty solid about the next time, assuming these terrible things don't happen again, you'll have a pretty good shot at passing if you brush up on those categories you weren't so comfortable in. But if you feel like you really did your best, nothing happened, maybe you got lucky on the topics, you felt really confident, and then you still were 20 points short, I think that's going to signal a larger issue that you need to work on.
Yeah. I think it's just important to be honest with yourself. I think that's one of the hardest things to do is to really go back and evaluate why you failed. I had someone I was talking to who recently got feedback on their past exam, and they were actually passing in some jurisdictions, not passing in another jurisdiction. And I think before really evaluating what happened in the essays, I think the feedback she would have given was, I did everything right. I don't have no idea how I didn't pass, but going through the questions, she started to see where she could have still been better. And that led to a really positive conversation about some of the things that she could do to overcome just these final barriers that she has, keeping her from this highest score. But, that's not easy work to put yourself into that position, to be vulnerable and to really kind of press yourself on what could have happened in the exam room. So whatever mental place you need to get in to do that work is very important.
Yeah, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, this one thing prevented me from passing. I didn't sleep, or I felt queasy, or this happened or that happened. But the reality is it's probably not really just one thing. You probably were leaving points on the table in your essays. And we're not saying this to be like, ha, 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 like you're wrong, but more to be proactive about it. Like, okay, well, maybe you have a bad day next time too. Let's figure out how you can still pass by actually picking up a few extra points per essay.
Yep. All right. So that was really our thoughts on, all you can learn from how close you were to passing. Those are a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. Seems obvious, but actually probably not.
Yeah, maybe I should have made this more than a 4-point list.
Well, I think sometimes people don't actually understand that they're as far away from passing as they are.
That's true. That's a good point. Okay, what about the next thing we think you can learn from your bar essay, which I think we've kind of said is your overall score breakdown. And this is when the states give you more information than just, what happened.
Yeah, and so most states will give you at least a breakdown of your MBE score versus your overall essay or performance test score. So here, I mean, basically you want to be looking at whether one of these is significantly lower than the other one. Because if so, obviously that's where you want to kind of focus your attention. You know, if your MBE score is significantly lower, then you need to raise that score in order to pass. However, it's a little bit of a balance because you also can't neglect all the other parts of the test. You know, I talk to a lot of people who do poorly on the MBE to start with, really do intensive work there, improve their score a lot, and then see their essay scores drop. Mm-hmm. So you don't want that to happen.
Yeah. If you do need to raise your MBE score, we are big fans of Adaptabar. I mean, you need to get this and do practice. We like Adaptabar because they use real practice questions licensed from the NCBE. And we'll be honest, some of your bar providers, the big commercial ones, don't. So you should ask if you don't know whether or not they use real release questions. We also really like Emmanuel's Strategies and Tactics if you like paper books. But we have pushed Adaptabar on the question of whether or not performance on the computer is different than performance on paper. And they seem to say that through their research, of course, I mean, I guess this makes sense, but that they're advocating for this, but they really don't see a huge difference. So even though you do end up taking the MBE on paper, I think you can do the practice on the computer and still be fine.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's so many benefits to doing it that way that I think any possible downside is pretty massively outweighed by the fact that you can get detailed breakdowns of what you're doing well on, what you're not doing well on. You know, you can focus on just certain types of questions versus just doing a bunch of mixed questions, all of that kind of thing. So, yeah. I mean, if you need to raise your MBE score, I think the first place to look is something like Adaptabar.
Yeah, and we have an interesting podcast with the founder of Adaptabar that we'll link to in the show notes, which allows you to get insight in why this kind of a tool is that beneficial. I mean, we use it with our students. We think it's really good.
Yeah, and you also, when you're doing these questions, I think you've got to evaluate why you're getting them wrong.
Yeah.
You know, so sometimes people just do a bunch of questions but don't really learn that much from them. So, you know, you've got to be, you know, really focusing on using this as a learning tool and a way to actually learn the law.
Yeah. Another thing that I have seen over the years when MBE scores might be high, but your writing scores are low. Something to look at is whether or not that means that you may have known enough law on exam day, but it's really your writing style or memorizing the rules in a way that you can easily spit them out on paper, maybe the flaw. So, you know, that can happen. You knock the MBE out of the park, but the writing holds you back. So make sure that you are, you know, saying, okay, if I am doing really well in the MBE, why am I doing so well in the MBE? Is it just that I'm really good?
What is it about this that I'm doing well on? I mean, because absolutely, I'm sure that was me. And no, I mean, literally, like, I'm good at taking standardized tests and I learned the 7 topic areas or whatever it is in the MBE world. But, you know, if you'd given me just the essays, I quite possibly would have failed.
Yeah. So I see these scores where you have somebody who really is successful with the multiple choice, but not with the essays. And if that's the case, that's not, I think, the most common scenario, but you can still learn things about that as well. From that, I guess you can still learn things from that as well, which will, you know, guide your study to be more strategic.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're seeing high MBE scores and low essay scores across the board, probably you are not writing in a style that's getting the most points, or you may not have enough substantive knowledge on the non-MBE topic areas. Yeah, so you might just be, we'll talk about this later, but you might be absolutely bombing, you know, half of the essays because you just don't know anything about trust and estates or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So here, I mean, I think, you know, I was saying, in order to fix this, I mean, you know, ideally you probably want some feedback to figure out what the actual problem is. And then you've got to just do a lot of practice questions.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to be thoughtful about is if you need to raise your essay and performance test score, you don't just need to do practice as in read a lot of those questions and then think about the answer, which I think is what a lot of people think is practice. You actually have to
Right, or outlining an answer.
Right, or outlining an answer. You actually have to write out the answer. So, you know, we have some tools that can help you with that. If you're not sure, you know, where to get practice questions, we have our Brainy Bar Bank tool, which is a database that has categorized practice questions so you can do very targeted practice and know what's the most heavily tested in each subject. We have our writing of the week, structured practice video series that walks you through MEE, MPT, and California essay questions. So these tools will give you all the practice problems you want. I don't think anyone's finished the Brainy Bar Bank yet. I think
that would be impressive.
It would be a feat. And we're also going to show you how to write a passing answer with, even if you have fairly minimal knowledge of the applicable law. So This is a place to start if you want to do some additional practice. And these are low cost tools compared to like a full tutoring program, either with us or another tutoring program or a whole nother bar prep program. So it's worth investigating what your options are because sometimes it's not as oppressively expensive as you think.
Yeah, exactly. I think these are, if you need to do writing practice, you basically should at least get the Brainy Bar Bank. It has all of the released ME or MPT or California questions for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So you're probably not going to run out of topics.
All right. So our third thing that we think you should look at in your score report is your individual essay and performance test score. So if you're lucky, your state's going to give you a detailed breakdown of your score on each essay and performance test. And this is really useful for a few reasons. I think the first reason that it is useful is it shows which substantive topics you're struggling with in the same way we kind of talked about the MBE questions. Sometimes their breakdown will show you which subjects you're struggling with. But hey, sometimes you're like, I know con law. I took advanced con law. I was a clerk. I did all of this stuff. I wrote my law review article on a constitutional law topic, and then you bombed con law, the question.
It happens. Look at Kathleen Sullivan. Wrote a con law textbook, failed the bar. Yep. So yeah, I think, you need to look at this in terms of what information can I get here? You're probably going to need to go back and figure out what were these topics on, to make sure you know what each performance test was about, what each essay was on, and then just really look, how did I do?
Right. And sometimes it can be a subject-specific problem, but oftentimes it can just be that maybe you missed the boat on a question. You could have misread the facts. You could have missed some of the legal issues, especially in states like California where the questions are longer. They're 60 minutes. There are crossover questions that cover more than one topic. Maybe you missed the cue that you needed to talk about a different topic. So there are lots of things that can happen, but you should be able to access the questions, even if not all jurisdictions have released any sort of model answer. You should be able to see the questions from the exam that you took, and you need to go back and figure out what those questions were and do some evaluation of why you struggled on the individual ones.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can also, so that's like the obvious stuff. Obviously you can look at it and be like, well, I didn't do so well in evidence. Right. But I think you can learn some less obvious things actually from the score breakdown too. One of those is, how are you performing across the day? So oftentimes people see a drop in their scores either over the course of the day or within a session. And typically that is two things or some combination thereof. Either it's fatigue or it is timing issues. So obviously, if you're spending too much time in the beginning, you're going to run out of time at the end. Your scores at the end are likely to be lower. You could also, just be fatigued. And so figuring out, you're thinking back, was I really hungry? Was I really distracted? All of those kind of things are going to give you a hint about what you can do to prepare differently, whether it's doing longer sessions to build your stamina, looking at day of issues like, your caffeine intake, your food intake, your sleep, all of these boring things, they can really impact you on test day.
Absolutely. Guys, I think that I have talked to plenty of students who made choices like eating French fries for lunch, like only French fries. And I love a good French fry. I've literally never met a potato that I don't want to eat. But if I were to only eat French fries for lunch, there is no way I could do a 3-hour focused exam after that. So
exactly. Or if you're like so jacked up on caffeine that you're literally throwing up, which we've heard before.
Yeah.
These things sound like they're nuts, but they're not nuts. You got to figure out what you need to do so that you can be focused and alert for those 3 hours.
Yep.
And if it's a timing issue, again, you've just got to get realistic about that. Sometimes people say, oh, well, I spent 2 hours on the first performance test on the MPT and then 1 hour on the second. It's like, well, that's probably why you scored significantly worse, on the second one. So some of this is just making yourself move on, but I think it's also a lot of practice and making sure that you're on point and you know how to do a quick outline. And for the MPTs or California performance test, you've got a strategy for getting through that packet and writing everything down as quickly as possible.
Yeah. If you see that your scores are consistently low or kind of highly variable, that can also signal a few different things. So let's say you're consistently getting low scores across the board. That's going to be a different problem from someone who does really well on some essays and performance tests and does terribly on others. So if your scores are consistently low, there's probably something across the board in the way that you're writing that's causing you to lose points. Typically, that means that you are lacking analysis or you're missing issues. So having somebody to look over your answers to help you identify kind of the low-hanging fruit can be a good idea. Other things that sometimes can happen, your answers are disorganized or very difficult to read. The graders might not even be seeing all the things that you're trying to raise. So you really need to, get help to identify what you need to do to clean up your essays. But if your scores are all over the place, then I think it's likely more of a substantive law issue. Right, Alison?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're knocking it out of the park on certain essays and then doing absolutely terribly on other ones, I'm going to probably assume you don't actually know that law.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly you're capable of writing in a way that gets you points. So if something's going on where you're not getting those points, I'm going to assume that you need to study more in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. We also sometimes will see score reports where the essays or the performance tests are much higher than the other. So if you're stronger on essays, that often can mean that you are much more comfortable with, very clear fact patterns, issue spotting. Maybe time management is easier when you're doing that. Performance tests can be so unique because they can really challenge you on time management or over a longer period of time, your reading speed. Sometimes people who are slow readers really struggle with the performance test.
And we see this a lot with foreign trained attorneys. Yep. Like maybe if you're taking the UBE, you can learn enough law and learn how to IRAC quickly enough to get through a 30-minute essay. But then when you are struggling with unfamiliar materials on the performance test and you're not as comfortable writing in that format because you haven't done it in your education so much, that can really sink people.
Yeah. I think that overall is just such a struggle for foreign trained attorneys, is just the ability to work at the speed necessary in English. Even if your English is impeccable, you're typically never going to write as fast as you have to on the exam in your work life.
Yeah, exactly. It's just something that you've got to figure out a strategy for doing well enough on it that you're able to pass.
Yeah.
Now, so here.
Oh, go ahead.
Good. I was just going to hear, I think if you do see a really strong variance in between your essays and performance tests, whatever direction that is, it's a pretty clear signal you need to get some assistance on that weaker area if you're going to have a good shot at passing.
Yeah. And one thing that I have seen happen is the performance test scores can oftentimes be really high, but the essays continue to remain low. And, that can signal that maybe your writing is around where it needs to be as far as style and communication, but something is still happening in the essays. So that usually means that you're not doing enough legal analysis or enough issue spotting and you've got to go back to the facts, or maybe you don't know the substantive law.
Or you're me and you just don't know the law.
Well, yeah. You're a special snowflake in that way.
I know, but I can guarantee you my performance test, I basically passed the California bar because of the MBE and the performance test. I guarantee you if you only graded my essays, I would say there was a very high likelihood I would have failed.
Yeah, it's probably good you took it when it was a 3-day exam. So we had a lot more grading from the performance test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, basically, I think any of these variances, if you see something out of a line with your other scores, you need to think about why that is. That's a big takeaway here.
All right. Our last thing to dig into on your score report is your topical performance on the MBE. Now, Alison, do the bar graders give you a very clear, clean report on how you did at the MBE, or do they make it some sort of logic game type puzzle? That
you really feel like you're sitting for the LSAT with this one. No, they do not make it easy. In fact, I think sometimes we still get emails from our tutors being like, "Am I interpreting this correctly?"
It's awful.
If you don't understand this when you first look at it, it does not mean that you are an unintelligent person. It just means that the way they've laid out this information is ridiculous. So what they're telling you with these percentage scores on the MBE per subject and then overall is how many people did worse than you who sat for this exam. So if you say you see torts and then 10%, and you're thinking like, oh, I did pretty well on torts. No, you did not do well on torts. That means that 10% of the people taking that MBE test did worse than you on torts. It means 90% did better. So here, you want to be looking at obvious outliers, whether it's pro or con, because that can help you identify areas you're stronger or weaker in. So basically a higher score is better. So, if you see that you're getting 50 or 60% on a certain topic, and then you're getting 5% on another topic, that's going to give you some suggestion of the substantive law that maybe you're not the strongest on. And often this carries over to the essays. I mean, for example, if you're getting basically no evidence questions right on the MBE, my guess is you're probably not acing that evidence essay either.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, like most things with the essays and everything else we've talked about, you got to look at your scores overall. And I get really angry and kind of flummoxed when I think about how they report these, because it's so unhelpful. You're super stressed. You get this score report and then you have no idea how to read these numbers. And, attorneys are notorious for being intimidated by math, and they're basically like making you do calculations to figure this out.
Yeah. So, I mean, here again, like you want to look at just on the essays, are your MBE scores consistently low? All right. Well, if they're consistently low, you might need help with MBE strategy or something like that. If they're really highly variable, then again, that could be a substantive issue. If you're knocking it out of the park on half the MBE topics and you're doing really well on those essays in those topic areas, but then you're bombing the other half, well, that probably means you've got some substantive law to learn.
Yeah. And you might even go back and see if you have any records of what your practice MBE scores were, whether or not any of these issues with certain subjects line up. It would be interesting to see, when you did your last 3-hour practice MBE, did you also struggle with property and then you struggled with property day of, or was it different? I think that can also be very telling if you still have some of that information.
Yeah, because sometimes people say, oh, I was doing really well on these topics with Adaptabar, but then I got to the real test and I obviously did poorly on them. Okay, well, maybe they just got weird questions or something.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of people, it's like, oh, yeah, I really do hate property and I didn't really study it. Okay.
Right. It shouldn't be too much of a shocker that you missed all those mortgages questions.
Exactly. But, that's just like you got to sit down and memorize it. You got to do a bunch of questions and it is learnable.
Yeah. So the bottom line here is, as you can take away from the last about half hour of us talking about it, it's possible to glean a lot of information from your bar exam score report. So you need to take some time and look it over and understand what it's telling you. Do not put it on a drawer. Do not throw it away. I've also heard people throw it away. Don't throw it away. Even if you don't want to read it, send it to somebody like us. Or
have a friend look at it and tell you what you think.
Don't throw it away. Because this information is the first step in diagnosing what happened, and you want to tailor your next round of studying to what actually happened. You don't just want to do the same thing again twice, because you need to fix the problems. Fixing the problems is how you're going to pass. Repeating the same mistakes is going to lead to typically the same outcome. That was kind of a dark note to end on. I don't know why that came out so negative.
Well, it's pretty much true.
It is. All right. Well, if you have questions about your score report and it is anxiety inducing for you to look at it yourself, you can reach out to us using our contact form on barexamtoolbox.com. And we'll be happy to tell you what we see. We'll link to this information on how to reach out to us in the show notes. And with that, I think we might be out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exams. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via the website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.